thank him for the privilege of doing this. I'm not so sure about the recording part, but okay. All kinds of folks out there are going to see this, maybe, probably not, but anyway. Hope I can keep you awake in all of this. This is perhaps something rather different than what you all have talked about. This is not your typical textual study kind of thing. A couple of you have had some of this. Some of this is going to be a nice review for some of you, but hopefully it's still valuable. The first discussion we're going to talk about this evening is the relationship of archaeology to the Bible. Now, as an archaeologist, and my doctorate is in archaeology from the University of Arizona with a minor in biblical studies, so I come at this sort of inverted from most of the folks here, and I excavate every year in Israel, field direct an excavation in Israel. That's not a commercial, but if you want it to be one, okay. And one of the questions that people often ask me, particularly in conservative church circles, Churches of Christ and so forth, is, well, it's usually a comment. It's along the lines of, wow, isn't it great how much archaeology proves the Bible? Well, I sort of cringe at that, but please let me explain what I mean by that. I'm certainly not arguing that archaeology has no relationship to biblical studies, because I'm convinced that it does. But I do believe that archaeology should not be approached as an apologetic, as a way to prove the Bible. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean it has no relevance to demonstrating the credibility of the Bible. But a better strategy of how to deal with archaeology is to approach it as, what can archaeology do to help us better understand what's going on in the biblical text? Clearly, the Bible is written in a sociological, cultural, geographical setting. Everything happens within some kind of setting like that, and you and I are removed from those events by thousands of years and by thousands of miles and variant cultures. Most of us don't know a whole lot about, say, Middle Eastern culture, particularly when we think in terms of the Arabic culture and so forth. And so those practices are rather significantly different than ours. The geography is little like Arkansas. If you're from the southwest United States, Arizona, and Southern California, the terrain and geography and environment are very, very similar to that. If you're familiar with San Diego area, where I grew up, you're aware that the San Diego is described as a Mediterranean climate, and hence it plugs into the very climate that characterizes this part of the world. Now, Israel itself, as we think in terms of Israel and the West Bank, varies significantly in geography, topography, weather patterns, and so forth. But the more we understand these kinds of things, the better equipped we are to understand what is going on in the Bible. Now, the way I often describe where you and I are in this study, and I'm not sure how much you all have talked about this, but I doubt seriously it'll have any kind of contradiction with Dr. Mathews' discussion. The Bible is not written directly to you and me. It was written to people in the ancient times. Now, that's not to say it's irrelevant to you and me. I honestly believe that the message of the Bible is relevant to us, but we are not the primary recipients. I liken it somewhat to imagining rummaging around in the attic of my grandparents' house and finding a cache of letters that my grandfather may have written to my grandmother, years and years and years ago. And while I open up those letters and can read them and understand a lot of what's going on there will inevitably be allusions and references to things that they shared, or to events that they attended, and to some trips that they might have made. And those might be lost to me. But one of the things that I can do is investigate and find out with clarity what was meant in those kinds of discussions. That's sort of how you and I are in this enterprise. We're sort of looking over the shoulder of the original recipients, reading on the document that God revealed to them. But yet, because of all of this lapse of time and mileage and culture and everything else, some of those things are sort of lost. And this is the kind of thing that archaeology can really, really help us better to understand what's going on in the pages of the Bible. I find, and I'm just fascinated with doing this kind of thing, because it's just amazing to me how much it opens up and makes real the events and the lives and oftentimes the teachings that are found in the pages of the Bible. So what I want to do in this presentation is talk about more directly how archaeology relates to the Bible. And I want to approach it not as a proof of the Bible, but as an enlightenment, a clarification, opening our eyes for a greater appreciation of what's going on. And I've divided the discussion into several categories, and if the thing will wake up here, all right, maybe not. Hello? Ah, there we are. That's the title, who cares? All right, things have to catch up with us. I've divided this into several categories, the first of which I'm going to refer to as customs of the Bible. And again, as we think in terms of the things that are going on in the Bible, a lot of things that are described there are very, very different than what you and I would do. Most of them we can catch up with, and a lot of times our translations will render these in suitable comparisons or suitable examples of our time. But one of the things the Bible talks about is, you shall not remove the ancient landmarks. I remember when I was a kid, I used to read this, and I was a preacher's kid, and so, you're forced to read the Bible when you're a little kid, and even though you may not want to, kind of thing. I'll be honest about that. But you'll run into these passages, and I used to read these passages out of the Old Testament, do not remove the ancient landmarks, and I used to think in terms of historical markers, driving down the highway, historical marker ahead. And, we'd occasionally stop and read, here at this location there was a great battle between the Confederates and the Yankees and blah, 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 blah. And that was one of the things that sort of kicked me a little bit interest in the Civil War kind of thing. But that's not what the ancient landmarks are in the Bible. And it really took a number of years for this to click with me that something else is going on. There are a number of occasions in the Old Testament where these kind of prohibitions exist. Do not remove the ancient landmarks. And here we have an example of one of these, although it looks sort of like a fence that's there. Now, this terrain, as you can look around in the background of this, there's a lot of rocks in this part of the country. I could tell you a story about that one, but I won't. That's tantalizing, isn't it? That's just sick. But anyway, this is one way to get the rocks out of the field, is make a little line here. But obviously that's not a very good wall. It's only about this high, and anything can get over this. So it's not going to keep anything out of anything. Goats can go over it, cats can go over it, dogs can babies can climb over this. I mean, it's nothing. But the practicality of this is to give a line of demarcation between someone's property and another person's property. Now, this isn't to say in this case we have different owners involved. But the ancient landmarks are basically survey marks that mark off one person's ownership of property from another. If you read in the book of Ruth, whenever Ruth comes back with Naomi to the land of Judah, to Bethlehem, the Bible talks in chapter 2, she happens to go to that part of the field that belonged to Boaz. Now, the people in the ancient world typically would live inside a town, and in the daytime they would go out into the fields to work and spend most of the day out there, and at the end of the day they would come back into town. In our culture, we have a tendency, if people are typically farmers, they'll live out in the field and occasionally come into town. But in ancient society, it was sort of the reverse of this. And one of the ways to demarcate property from one another is to line up the stones there. Now, the next example shows a little better example of this. The dotted line represents the line separating this person's property from this person's property. And again, I don't know if specifically that's the case here, but this is the kind of thing the people in the ancient world would have. Now, if you look at this and think in terms of, I want to be a cheater, I want to increase my land holdings, under occasion, say, of a new moon, which means there is no moon, if you recall, you go out there and sneakily move all of those over about 6 inches and do that several months in a row, then you can increase your parcel and decrease your neighbors, and the Bible condemns that as land wrestling, stealing property from someone else. Now, part of the issue here is the preservation of the inheritance that is passed on from generation to generation. Part of it has to do with the God's welfare system, if you will, maintaining the integrity of the property for orphans and widows and so forth. So God is concerned about the land rights, and that's what these refer to when God gives these kinds of prohibitions, and occasionally He'll refer to them as lessons. Here is a region that shows a rather clear crop differentiation. Obviously that crop's different than that one, but you look through the middle part of that field and you can see sort of that line of demarcation separating one parcel from another. And so this is the kind of thing the Bible is talking about when it refers to the ancient landmarks. Another thing that appears in the Bible in Isaiah chapter 5 and in the Gospel of Matthew is a reference to building watchtowers. In both cases, they are set up in situations of parables. This is a watchtower that I saw up in the area of Samaria now a long time ago, and grabbed this picture. And again, when I would read the story about watchtowers, I would sort of transpose that to my earlier childhood living in East Tennessee, back before we had a lot of as much airplane traffic as we have now. And the watchtower was typically something that was built up on a hill to watch out for forest fires. And so I had a tendency to think in terms of the watchtower as being that. Well, the watchtowers in the ancient world were not primarily for fire prevention. They were primarily geared toward prevention of theft of crops. At the time of harvest that would come, there's a tendency for people to come along and steal the crops out of the trees and so forth. And at harvest time, they would post somebody out there on the watchtower to make sure that the crops remain intact, someone doesn't come along and steal it. And of course, there are still those people that will steal things. My daughter and son-in-law own a farm, alfalfa farm out in California, and it's really interesting at harvest time when Casey will bale the hay and have it stacked up. He's always concerned, and rightfully so, about someone coming along and stealing the bales of hay. And so he sort of goes paranoid sometimes about that, but I'm not faulting him for that because there is that reality. Interestingly, this plugs into the timeless nature of some elements of humanity. There's always going to be those who are going to be dishonest. And so this is a prevention dealing with that. Notice again the rocks that are still in the field here. Another thing that the Bible talks about is the practice of threshing. And here we have a threshing sledge in the background, and in the foreground is an ancient plow. Now the plow itself in this case is not necessarily old, neither of these are necessarily old, but they are rather timeless in design. We can see pictures in some of the Egyptian paintings and so forth, a plow that looks almost exactly like that from ancient times. Nothing changed until fairly modern times. But the threshing sledge is what I want us to notice in particular. This is standing on end. It normally would be lying down flat, but it's a case, in this case, of 3 boards that are tied together, bonded with a reinforcement tie on the other side. And then they would drill holes in the bottom of it and jam pieces of flint in this. And they would, when they cultivate the grain, whether it's barley or wheat, they would spread it out on a hard surface like this, and they would drag the threshing sledge around on this. Now, the hooves of the animals, whether horses, donkeys, or cows and so forth, would serve as a braking component as well. But those threshing sledges with those pieces of flint in there being dragged around would break this up into smaller and smaller pieces until finally you just have this mess that is there. Now this demands then that you separate the chaff, the grain, or the stalk parts away from the grain. Well, that's where you come into the process of winnowing. And they would go out there with a fork, such as this individual is doing, and stick it into that pile of debris that looks like, and throw it up in the air on a windy day, and the wind will blow the lighter chaff away, and the grain, being heavier, will fall back to the ground. And you do this over and over and over and over and over and over and over until you get to a point where you don't see any dust blowing away. Now, John the Baptist refers to this practice when he talks about Jesus coming. His winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will, the implication that there's already been threshing, his winnowing fork is in his hand, and he's going to separate the wheat from the chaff, and he'll gather the grain into his barns, and the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire. So he's plugging into this practice that has gone on for millennia. I remember being over in Israel on one occasion, traveling around up on Mount Carmel region, and there was a gentleman that had come out, and he was, actually it was Tabor, excuse me, who cares. Anyway, he had his grain out there underneath a tree, and he was beating it with a stick in order to winnow it. And it was just fascinating. I grabbed my camera real quick and take a shot, but it's one of those, doesn't have very good background, it's sort of hard to tell what's going on. But people can still be engaged in this kind of activity. This is, we would sometimes refer to this perhaps as primitive, but it's very functional, very labor intensive. Now, once they winnow it and get all the grain or the chaff out of this, at least as much as they can, they're going to gather it up and put it in storage. Well, here is a photograph where I was visiting the site of Gibeon, and the piles of grain are there on the threshing floor. And in this case, they're waiting to take it off, put it in storage. Now, some of them are covered in plastic in the background. I'm not at all suggesting that plastic in the ancient world. But this is a kind of setting, again, that comes back to the book of Ruth. If you remember the story in chapter 3 of book of Ruth, Naomi encourages Ruth to go to the threshing floor where they have been threshing the grain and so forth, and apparently winnowing it as well. And she then comes and sneaks up to the feet of Boaz as he's sleeping, and she lies down at his feet. I won't go into all the implications of that, but he is sort of resting on this, sort of makes a little nest inside his pile of grain, and it serves as a mattress. And then, let's just put it this way, negotiations for the marriage ensue. And but it's a setting very similar to this. Now, the reason he's staying there is, again, to prevent the theft of crops. So it comes back to that reality again. As I was leaving the site, I was traveling along and looked down the slope and saw this building here with something on the roof, and was just fascinated with this because it immediately reminded me of Rahab hiding the spies on the roof of her house under the flax. And you're studying Joshua, so it plugs well into where you are right now. But I don't know if you're aware of it. There's a statement in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 22, I believe it is, about verse 8 or so, where God gives a legislation that when you build a house, you shall have a low wall around it, some versions say a parapet, in order to keep people from falling off, anticipating that the roof would be used for multiple activities. And if you actually go through the Bible and begin to look at the activities that are conducted on a roof, you'll have, for instance, Saul sleeping on the roof when he goes and is eventually anointed by Samuel. Now, you and I have a tendency perhaps to read that as if, well, it must have been hot, so he goes to the roof to sleep in the cool of the evening, which certainly would be true. But the point is, the roof was commonly used for these kinds of activities, for sleep. You have Rahab drying flax or storing flax on the roof. You'll have Peter in the book of Acts going to the roof to pray. Again, I used to always read that thinking it was just getting away from the hubbub of the city life. But again, the roof would often be used as a place sort of like a patio. You remember the narrative when David is, the time when kings go out to war and he has his army off in Ammon or Rabbah, and he then rises from his, I refer to it as a siesta, and he's walking on the roof of his house and he sees Bathsheba down the way and problems ensue. Now, I used to read that, but please don't connect this with Veggie Tales. If you've seen that one where, you know, the king goes out there and is looking around for the rubber ducky. I don't know if any of you have seen that. I have grandkids, and so I've been forced sometimes to see some of this. But that was not the situation. David is not on his roof as a peeping Tom. He very likely is simply there in the cool of the evening and enjoying the relaxing atmosphere, and he happens to notice this woman down the way, probably down the slope of the valley, taking a bath. Now, footnote here, the Bible does not say she is on the roof. The Bible doesn't say where she is, so don't overread the text. Anyway, but this is an example, and it's interesting that you have this building legislation. We might refer to it as a building code. And I'm not going to say it's the first building code, because actually you look in some of the earlier laws in other Mesopotamian places, there are building codes that are in place. But the Bible does have that. Whether they had inspectors or not is another question. Now, as we move on down the way, we have another view of Gibeon. Gibeon was really a fascinating site. Still is, but it's changed a lot. And here is the city that is set on a hill, and this is the city from down below. And of course, I'm reminded of Jesus' remark, a city set on a hill cannot be hid. Sort of a maxim. If you actually think about it, it makes perfectly good sense. If a city's on top of a hill, it's easy to see. But there's a reason cities in Palestine, in the land of Canaan, the West Bank, typically are built on hills. Now, unless you get down in the coastal plain where it's fairly flat, most of those cities and towns in the inner areas are almost always built on a hill. Several reasons for this. One, it's easier to defend. It's always easier to defend yourself from a higher elevation when somebody has to climb up a hill to get to you. Secondly, because of the erosion that has taken place through time, a lot of the hills become denuded and the soil has flowed down into the valleys and it's relatively rich. And there's not a whole lot of territory that's available for agriculture. So you don't want to come along here and build your town down here where otherwise you need to do your farming. So you sort of escape that by the dual benefit of the higher elevation for defense purposes and the need for the agricultural land. Now, that raises a problem that becomes a challenge, and we move now to technology in the ancient world. The people in the ancient world were much more sophisticated oftentimes than we give them credit for. We have a tendency many times to be very intellectually snobbish and think that people in the ancient world weren't very sophisticated. I dare say if you and I were plucked from our world and dropped into theirs, we would not survive very long. Or we'd have to certainly adapt rather quickly. But the people in the ancient world were quite sophisticated in what they did with what they had. Now, one of the problems that arises if you have a city that is built on a hill is normally the water supply is not up there. Normally the water supply, if there is one, will be at the foot of the hill. And the Bible will refer a number of times in its text to people going outside the city to the well. And that, for instance, goes on when Saul is coming to see Samuel at Ramah, and the people are coming out of the city to go down to the well and so forth, and he meets them and asks, is the prophet here, and so forth. So this is a common kind of element, but the problem of having the water source outside the city means that the water source is vulnerable for enemy sabotage, and hence the threat then if you have to go out to the water source during time of warfare, you then are vulnerable. So the folks in the ancient world come up with a number of strategies by which to resolve this. Now, this is the entrance into one part of the water system at Gibeon. Gibeon is a fascinating site. It's amazing how many things here you can go and see. And here I'm about to enter into this tunnel, and as we go into the interior, this is my wife standing up there. It was February, and so she's bundled up pretty good. And you go into this tunnel and you come down this flight of steps, which are sort of precarious at best. And as you proceed down the way, you finally get to this point where there is a water source that you can access from inside the town. Now, they would have blocked this off on the outside to allow the water to come in, and you would come down this, through this tunnel, and then come to the water, fill it up, and go back up the slope to the interior. Now, there's another water source or access that is at Gibeon as well. In some ways more sophisticated, but it's not totally complete. But it is referred to, interestingly, in the Bible. And it looks like this. This is a drawing of it. This is cut through limestone, and I'm not sure what the depth of it is. Offhand, I don't remember the dimension, but it's really quite large. It's cut through limestone, and you come down to this landing, and there's an element of scale you can see here by the drawing that they put here of these little people standing on that platform. And there's a flight of steps that's carved in or shown in this, and then it goes through this mass of rock, and then the tunnel continues down until finally you get down to the bottom and fill up your jar, and then you climb back out up this rather precipitous, precarious flight of steps. Now, typically, not always, but typically the work of going down here and getting the water and climbing in and out was work for women in the ancient world. There are allusions to this, references to this, for instance, in the book of Genesis. But you also have to realize that these water jars were often, well, they're either jars or skins, but the jars, if they're jars, would be something like that. I'll show this further in a moment. And not light to begin with, and then you fill it up with water, then you've got quite a bit of weight. I don't think I'd want to wrestle with these women in the ancient world. You know, they're constantly going down there carrying these big jugs of water and everything else and carting back out. But there's also a hazard that arises because these steps, because there's constant traffic going up and down them, they get slick, and the time, of course, comes and somebody's going to lose the balance and drop the jars, and then the water starts flowing down the steps, and then slime starts to grow, and it just becomes a mess. Rather precarious, to say the least. Now, looking at a picture of this, there is the flight of steps. See that hump right there? Let me move over out front here. There's a hump right there. I'm sorry I'm blocking your way. And then if you look over there on that section, that hump corresponds to this. Can you see that? Some of you are a little more direct. You can see the connection. But the flight of steps, I could not get far enough away from this with my camera to get a nice wide-angle lens, and I didn't have much of a wide-angle lens on it. But here I am standing on that platform a number of years ago. And this is a fairly normal parallax or lens on the camera taking the picture. So you can get an idea that that's fairly deep down there. Now, this is referred to in the book of Samuel, 2 Samuel, whenever Saul has died and you have 12 soldiers from David's army and 12 soldiers from the remnants of Saul's army gathering at the pool of Gibeon. And they have this, I won't call it one-on-one, but 12-on-12 confrontation, and it takes place here. Now some will say, well, wait a minute, it's a Gibeon, but the text talks about the pool of Gibeon. And it almost certainly has to be somehow in relationship to this shaft. And this shaft does date back, as far as archaeologists are able to tell, back to a period before the time of David and Saul. My opinion is, and I think it's sort of interesting, I can't prove it at all, my opinion is that the 24 people are on this platform sort of in a forced arena into contact with each other. And the Bible talks about all 12 of them killed each other. I mean, the 24 is battle it out and they all die. And it's again then referred to in the book of Jeremiah simply as a geographic reference point. But it appears twice in the pages of Scripture. Some sophistication in the ancient world is really, really impressive. Now, most of us look at Tutankhamun's tomb and all that kind of thing and are wowed by that. But that kind of sophistication extends broadly beyond simply Egypt. These are some very, very nicely carved ivory pieces. Book of Amos will refer to the decadence of the children of Israel at a time when they ought to be concerned about the well-being of their fellow citizenry, of lying on their beds of ivory. And Amos just lambasts them for their neglect for the needs for those who are less fortunate. And these are parts of some of those pieces of furniture. Oftentimes they would be, if I drag up a chair over here, the parts of the ivory, imagine this chair, for instance, having arms on it. And so you'd have an arm here, and some of this ivory pieces would be the inset between the arm pieces or in the back of the chair itself as the back piece. And typically the scholars and the art historians will look at this as Syrian production that is therefore imported into the land of Israel. We don't have a lot of evidence of the Israelites having this kind of craftsmanship, but it also implies therefore some rather extensive trade over, and not in this case thousands of miles, but certainly in, several hundred. Anybody tell me what this is? Making sure it's not labeled. No guesses? Close. It's actually sewer pipes, though. Close enough, I'll accept that. These are sewer pipes from 1800 BC, in the time of the patriarchs. And I don't know how much you're familiar with construction materials and so forth. It's only been in fairly recent times, been easily within my lifetime, that sewer pipes have moved from being made out of clay with a flared end, and you put one end in, the narrow end into the flared end and seal it up with clay. Then they went to this awful asphalt ply stuff that is just terrible. And then eventually they started coming out with the plastic kind that most of us are familiar with. But that plastic stuff only comes into use since about 1980 or so. And earlier sewer pipes were almost always made out of clay. Now these are about this big around, about what, a foot, 10 inches to 12 inches in diameter. And if you look carefully, you'll see that one end is slightly tapered in to fit inside the other end, and then they would seal it with clay. Now I don't want to suggest all cities in the ancient world had sewer systems, but they did have, some of them did have these drainage systems. And to think in terms of cities as early as the patriarchs having this is impressive. Now if you actually travel around in the ancient world and some of these sites, you'll find that there's a lot more of this kind of sophistication. If you go to Mycenae, for instance, they had sewer systems and all of that as well. But these are the kinds of things that we tend to overlook when we are thinking in terms of the people of antiquity. Again, we have a tendency to be rather intellectually snobbish and think we're the ones at the top of the heap and so forth, and we're almost the first ones to ever thought of a lot of this stuff. Now, looking at, this is the site where I excavate and am field director, and a number of years ago there was an accidental discovery that was made. A lot of the discoveries are somewhat accidental. And a couple of guys were excavating and they found this opening in the ground. And they reported it to the directors and said, well, we what looks like a cistern. And the directors sort of wrote it off. Yeah, there's cisterns all over the place. So these guys took their video camera and turned it on and locked it on and put it on a rope and turned the light on and dropped it down in there, lowered it, I guess is a better term, and then rotated it around to see what was happening, and then brought it up and looked at it, and this thing was huge. And so they decided they would get some spelunkers to come in and drop some rope ladders down through the shaft, and they got down in there and saw this huge cistern. Now, this was eventually found. This was not what was initially discovered. It's the opening right here at the top that they initially found, and they dropped the camera in, and they could see the arms of this radiating off from the center. And when they were down in there checking all of this out, they recognized there's a lot of soil that seems to tumble in down this arm. And taking a compass and measurements and everything else, they went back up to the surface and began to excavate and found that flight of steps that we were just looking at. And finally cleared it out. And here's sort of an isometric perspective view of what the system looks like. This is the shaft that was originally found, through which they lowered the camera. And then they saw the spill coming through this and went over to this area and began to excavate and found the flight of steps that comes down and makes this turn and then enters into this huge cruciform reservoir. The capacity of this is about 211,000 gallons of water. Now that equates to about 5 standard, which are not usually huge, but 5 standard in-ground backyard swimming pools. Now, if you think in terms, I mean, you and I use a lot of water, so in one sense it might not register a whole lot with us, but that's a lot of water. And this is dug out of solid limestone, but the limestone has a tendency to lose water. Water seeps through that fairly easily, so they have to plaster it. And you can go down into this, you can still today go down into it, and you can go down in there, and some of the plaster, a lot of plaster is still on the walls about this thick. Now the cistern, about, to give some point of reference, this is about 4 inches or so thick. And you have to realize that the cistern went out of use and was buried and obliterated by the Assyrians in about 680 or so BC, never to be found again until the early 1990s. And a lot of that plaster was still on the wall in that damp environment. Now, if you know anything about construction techniques, we don't seem to be able to make plaster to stick on a wall for very long. It tends to fall off and collapse and all that kind of. We need to take a few lessons from these folks. They knew what they were doing, and they did it well. And it's really impressive to see how much of that plaster is still on the wall in that damp environment. This is a representation, a photograph of a surgical procedure known as trephination. This dates from the 7th century BC from the site of Lachish. And a number of these examples have been found. Now, I'm not going to suggest that the people of the ancient world always understood what was going on when they had headaches and stuff. But this apparently is a surgical procedure that they would engage in now and then, probably because of headaches that were chronic and trying to relieve it. Now, this person, normally they would say, cut the flap of skin, fold the skin back, and then saw. You can see the saw marks? You see the saw marks on that? Saw this skull plate out, and I assume that they felt like they'd liberated the spirits. I don't know if I would know that or not by the pain that's involved. And then put the flap of skin back and hope the person survives. Well, this person didn't survive very long. And we know that by the fact that the cut marks are still rather crisp, if you will. But a lot of the folks who underwent this surgical procedure in the ancient world survived. And examples of these have been found where the hole has been totally grown closed. Raises some interesting questions. One, why did they do this, for which we don't have much of an answer? Secondly, what kind of drug would you use? That would probably be the most lurking question in my mind. What do you give the person to kill the pain, or at least make them oblivious to the pain in the procedure? Well, I'm not sure I have the answer, but I do have a proposal for you, which we'll move to here in a second. moving into the area of ancient trade. This is a nice little vessel. I have a sample of one here. This is not my best example because I think it's at home. This is the standard size of the vessel that we have shown on the screen up here. This one's broken, as you can see. The handle's missing. It's been cut off and so forth. But you have this broken section. But they're delicate, nice little pieces like this. We refer to these as bills. We don't know what the folks in the ancient world refer to them as. But this is one of those, archaeologists aren't always the brightest folks in the world. And we name it after something that's fairly bizarre, to say the least. If you were to fill this up, obviously it's not going to hold much, but if you were to fill this up when it would be complete and pour the liquid out, it would go bill, 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 bill. And so we call it a bill. Like I said, we're not always the brightest folks in the world. But as you look at the photograph here, I want you to notice some features here. You notice this one has these little clay appliques on the surface. There's a little clay section up here around the collar. This one has a clay applique as well as the applique on the body. This one, while it doesn't have the raised sections, it has white lines drawn on it. And you can see the remnants of the white line drawn on the body. Well, this was rather intriguing. This comes from the late Bronze Age, and these are almost exclusively to the late Bronze Age, which, by the way, is the time period that the Israelites appear, according to the Bible, within the land of Israel. And a lot of scholars looked at this and wondered, these are nice little delicate vessels. What in the world would they be used for? They seem to have been imported from the island of Cyprus predominantly, not necessarily exclusively. Even the Israelites, or not the Israelites necessarily, but the people in the land of Canaan were so enamored with them they made imitations of them. Usually rather klutzy, but nonetheless they were imitations of them. Well, some scholars wrestling with what do you do with these things decided that, it looks sort of odd. If you turn it over, it looks sort of like an opium poppy. Well, I'll be honest with you, I'm not really that much into opium to make this immediate connection. But this is the connection they had. Now, if you look at this, you notice the sort of flared, let me go to the next one. You notice the flared edge there that would sort of correspond to that, sort of the bulbous body that is there. And even the little ridges that are down the shaft you would have replicated on here. Now, the one mainly, not necessarily exclusively, who suggested what these might be used for is an archaeologist, but he was an ambassador to Israel from Australia for a number of years. And he suggested maybe these were used for shipping opiate derivatives. And the typical response was, you're loony. Well, eventually archaeology got to the point where it's looking at science and using sciences rather extensively. And so some of these are submitted for analysis and a very careful cleansing of the interior of the vessels and running them through various scientific tests, spectrometers and that kind of thing and so forth. I don't know specifics, but I think that would work, at least play into it. And at least some of the vessels were found to have opiate derivatives from the inside. Well, that sort of makes me wonder, could that be what they used to drug them for trephination? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I think an opiate derivative would probably knock you out pretty well if you took enough of it. Maybe this also helped the Israelites conquer the Canaanites. Maybe the Canaanites were a bunch of drug heads, and the Israelites come in and whack them a good one. I don't know. Intriguing question. The Bible does talk about sending a hornet before them. Maybe the hornet was in the form of their buzzed. Anyway, hadn't thought of that one before, but anyway. Another element of trade that we have are these oxhide copper ingots that are occasionally found. Now, these are not usually found on land. These will almost exclusively be found in the ocean, underwater archaeology. The reason they're called oxhide ingots, I think, is fairly obvious. It's sort of in the shape of a stretched oxhide and so forth. The weight of these is usually designated to be a talent. a talent. Remember in the New Testament there are these discussions about a parable where Jesus talks about people being given talents, 5 talents, 2 talents, 1 talent. We have a tendency sometimes to collapse that to abilities that God has given us. That's not the point. That's not the story. It has to do with a measure of quantity that is involved. And a talent of copper, and that was usually considered the standard weight for the talent, came to be roughly 28 to 30 kilograms. Now, if you're not really up on your metric system, that's about 62 to 66 pounds. And so this would be a talent. Now, the way these are typically transported is on ships, they would line them up, hanging them by the splayed end, the stretched end, and hang them in racks. Now, I used to live in Arizona, which is where I got my doctorate, and lived in a copper mining town. And had a couple of these pictures and showed them before I got a huge slew of pictures. And it was really interesting to watch the copper mining folks, who many of them worked at the smelter and so forth, and they looked at this and says, wow, that's not a whole lot different than we do now. And they described more squared angles, but with the little ears at the top, and they hang them on the racks and put them on the rail cars and everything else and ship them out to other destinations all over the world. So again, the folks in the ancient world have figured out this rather expedient way to transport goods. Now here's where this becomes important. Most of us don't stop really and think about these kind of things, but clearly it doesn't take a genius to figure out no one location has everything. You know, Cersei doesn't have gold mines, to my knowledge. Doesn't have silver mines, doesn't have copper mines. Diamonds are down southwest section of Arkansas, but that's a real rarity. Most people don't find anything when they go there. But when we think about all of these raw materials, no place has all of them. And so people over time will find out, well, they've got copper over there, they have tin over here, they have silver over there, they have gold over here, they have onyx over here, they have obsidian and so forth, and you'll want various quantities of these, and so a trade network begins to develop over time. And that's exactly the way people find out about it, and they begin swapping goods. Now, one of the things that's very important for us to realize as we think in terms of these trade connections is to realize that not just the mileage that's involved, although that's important. You know, how far is it from point A to point B? But then to have the second level of the calculation, recognizing how much time does it take to make that trip. And prior to the advent of the automobile and our easy access to fairly rapid travel or flying, people in the ancient world, and even up until, early part of the 20th century, a lot of the travel was simply by horse or walking or whatever. And you're not looking at over 20 miles a day. Now let's put that in perspective. It's 45 miles from here to Little Rock. So under those kind of circumstances, it would take you at least 2.5 days to make a trip to Little Rock. So when you start thinking in terms of people trading goods over 1,000 miles, to you and me, 1,000 miles isn't that far. But 1,000 miles in the ancient world or pre-industrial world is really significant from the standpoint of time consumption. And yet you have these goods that are being swapped over huge distances. And as we read the Bible and see the kinds of discussions, for instance, when the Queen of Sheba comes from wherever that is, we're not sure whether it's Yemen or Ethiopia, and makes the trip to Jerusalem, if you just do a quick and dirty calculation here, it's like 1,400 miles. She travels, and if you think in terms of 20 miles a day, which everybody would have been dead on the trip, but if you think in terms of 20 miles a day, you're talking about a 2-month trip one way to go see Solomon. I mean, this just changes the dynamic significantly. But this is the kind of stuff we have a tendency to trivialize because of our different cultural world and how things operate. All right, here are a couple of drawings out of Egyptian sources and so forth. I want you to notice the oxhide ingots being carried here. There's one up there by that guy, and there are 2 down here being carted along with other goods that they're transporting. Now this is back at the site of Gibeon. Gibeon was known in the ancient world, not quite in the earlier Old Testament period, but sort of the Persian period, as a wine-producing area. And these are some storage vats that are in the stone here that have been carved out of the interior in which to store wine. And it's estimated that they could store 25,000 gallons of wine here. And the wine of Gibeon became fairly popular in the ancient world. Now, we are nearing the end, in case you're wondering. This is from the site of Ekron. This is where I actually began my excavating experience back in 1985. And we're looking at an olive press facility. I didn't excavate this one, but here is the vat in the middle in which the olives would be placed, the green olives, typically predominantly green, and they would be put in there in a stone about a foot in diameter and about a foot and a half long, 2 feet long maybe, would be put in here and roll back and forth to crush this into a sort of big pulpy mass. You can imagine how drippy and oily this would be. And then they scoop this up and put it in sort of like burlap bags and stack them on top of these two presses on the side. And then there would originally have been a wall back here with an opening in it with a huge beam, and they would press these burlap bags with counterweights on the end in order to get the oil to go press into the vats here. Now, the next photograph shows a reconstruction of this. There's your crushing basin. Here is the olive oil press and the burlap bags there with the beam coming out and the counterweights. And they would press the oil and get it into the vats, and then they would carefully pour quite warm water in here and lift the oil up and dip it off into the jars here and then ship it off to the ancient world. Now, at Ekron, which is a Philistine site, over 100 of these olive press installations have been discovered. You have to understand that it's only processing oil about 2 months out of the year before the season dies. And the estimated production capacity is, professionals coming in evaluating this, is about 1.1 million liters of oil a year. Now again, if you're not up on your metrics, that's slightly larger than a quart. That's a lot of olive oil. And some evidence has been found through studies of ceramics and so forth that some of this was exported as far as Spain in the ancient world. We're talking about thousands of miles away. Now this is a New Testament example of sort of a domestic olive oil producing facility. There would be the post in the middle, the large stone, the olives would be placed on the platform, and this would be rolled around and around and around and around to crush the olives, and then the olive oil would sort of percolate off to the side into a little trench and then drip off into storage jars and juglets and so forth. But what's interesting is not so much the procedure here as what Jesus says about this. In Matthew, I think it is chapter 18, Jesus talks about the influence that we have on people. And he says, if anyone causes one of these little ones that believes on me to stumble, it would be better for him that a great millstone be hung around his neck and it be cast into the depth of the sea. This is the kind of thing that Jesus is talking about. And I have a hunch you wouldn't escape. The point is, I think, quite impressive. He doesn't simply say throw them into the sea, but I guess this would be the ancient version of concrete boots. If we think in terms of the mafia. Government. Can't escape government. This is an interesting little collection of material that was found a few years ago at Tekoa. And the excavators, this has been sort of put back in place to give some impression of what it probably looked like originally. But you'll notice something in here. And this is this picture of two of the vessels, and the inscription on the side says Hamash, which would translate in this case to a fifth, not to be confused with Jack Daniels or Southern Comfort. But it's probably a reference, yeah, that was said at Harding, probably in reference to a tax rate, maybe a 20% tax rate that's under consideration. The contents turned out to be these pieces of silver that were chopped up and stuffed into the jar. And then the vessels were probably kept in reserve to be shipped off to the central government, indicating probably a 20% tax rate or so. Now, this is the way people in the ancient world would do their money. You remember the Bible will often talk about shekels. The Old Testament will talk about shekels, and we have a tendency to collapse shekels into the idea of a coin, and that's not what it was. A shekel would be a weight. All it is a weight, and they would use a scale similar to this, and they would put a known weight on one side, such as, what's this, 2 grams, and put it in there, and then they put whatever the silver is, if they want 2 grams in here, and they would put it and counterbalance it. This is really a quite sophisticated system. And if you remember anything about early stores here in the United States, this is a very similar system that characterized weights and measures until modern electronics. Not much different. So again, the sophistication of the people in the ancient world was quite high. You'll notice the cut marks that are on this. And what they would do is they'd have maybe jewelry or a chunk of silver, and they need to counterweight this, and so they just sort of shave off or cut off or pinch off a piece and drop it in there until they get it balanced, and that's the end of it. And you have bent jewelry, and you have chunks of silver, and all of that that's involved. And of course, then there's religion. This is a New Testament issue. This is a baptistry at Khorvat Shivta in the southern part of Israel, out in the Negev, an area where that gets about 6 to 8 inches of rain a year. That's it. If you know anything about agriculture, normally you can't grow anything just from rainfall on the basis of that. And it's rather iffy, rather dicey whether you're going to succeed or not. So you need water reservoirs available in order to access water. But yet, in spite of that scarcity of water, the church here is using immersion as the strategy by which to perform baptism. And my suggestion here is that if sprinkling or pouring were a legitimate meaning of baptism in this period, why not sprinkle and pour rather than go to all the trouble and, quote, wasting the water to immerse? It's not proof, but it's an interesting question as you look at the archaeology and activity involved. Most of you are familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and this is Cave 4 at Qumran. And the discoveries here were certainly profound. This is a photograph of one of the jars. And I have here a replica of a Dead Sea Scroll type jar. And they're not all this size. They're not necessarily even all this shape. But this is a replica of one of the kinds. And then the scrolls would be kept inside the vessel like this and closed up. And part of the point is to control the atmosphere, to be a convenient location to keep them, to preserve them for a future retrieval. But of course, the Dead Sea community never came back. And those scrolls and those jars were there for a couple of thousand years until finally in 1947, this guy's chasing a goat and happens to accidentally find all of this. Now, the scrolls themselves are rather fascinating. This is a picture of one of the manuscripts, a column from the commentary on Habakkuk. But I want you to notice something here. Now, not all the scrolls do this. I want to emphasize that very quickly. Not all the scrolls do what I'm pointing out here, but many of them do. This is a commentary, and as you look through this, this is written in Aramaic script Hebrew, characteristic of the post-exilic period. But as you glance along here, you'll notice that there is a cluster of letters right there that's written differently. Can you see the difference in style there? And then as you come on down here, these oddly are a little more pronouncedly different. These are letters that are written in Paleo-Hebrew. And the letters that we have here in Paleo-Hebrew are the Tetragrammaton, the name Yahweh. So that when they come to the name Yahweh in this manuscript, rather than simply write his name in the same script, they would stop and write it in an antiquated form to show reverence and respect for the name of God. And of course the mindset was, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, and so this is one way that they are manifesting that reverence for the name of God. I really don't think God had that in mind whenever he gave the command, but at the same time we have to at least appreciate their effort to try and manifest this reverence for God as they're copying. And that brings us to the end of this discussion. Are there any questions that you might have? You can wake up now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob.